Um, Hi everyone, welcome back to another Concord and Victory interview. Today we're here with Luke Hares, who is Chief Technologist at CMR Surgical. So Luke, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Certainly. So, yes, my name's Luke Hares. I am the Chief Technology Officer at CMR Surgical, one of the co-founders. My job at CMR is to have overall responsibility for product development, technology research, product vision, and intellectual property, mainly sort of focused around our Versius laparoscopic surgical robot.
That's really, really interesting. And we've actually got one of the prototypes here for one of the robots. So how did you kind of get into this field of medicine or engineering? It's quite a niche and quite new field. So
Yeah, sure. So my background is I'm a physicist. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a clinician. And I studied natural sciences at Cambridge University. And I graduated in 1996. And then I went to go and work in the various contract research and development companies around Cambridge. So there's a lot of these around Cambridge. The most famous is called Cambridge Consultants, but they all sort of started in the 50s. And they are companies that do contract research and development. So essentially, if you're a company that wants to develop something new, you haven't got the sort of engineering talent or expertise in-house, you can basically hire one of these companies to do it for you. And they're very good companies for somebody like me who knows a little bit about a lot of things. And so I was able to work on a great range of products in many, many different areas over about sort of 20 years, including in the field of surgical robotics. A company in Canada asked the company I was working for to help them develop a surgical robot. And that development didn't go well, the surgical robot didn't work. And after that, to give you an idea of the range, the project I was working on after that was a handheld steam cleaner. Terrifying device. So, but what working for that company showed me, and this is part of the joys of these kind of companies, is you get to see a lot of things, is that there was this massive unmet need. So there's a type of surgery called keyhole surgery, minimal access surgery. Its technical name is laparoscopic surgery. And if you do a sort of brief history of surgery, so surgery kind of has been going on really as long as there's been recorded human history. So let's say, I don't know, 6,000 to 7,000 years. And for most of that period of time, what you wanted from your surgeon was that they were fast. Surgery was an unpleasant business, and the only reason it was happening to you is because the alternatives were worse. In about the 1850s, modern surgery was invented with anesthetics and the rediscovery of the importance of cleanliness. And really what that did is that allowed surgeons to slow down. And really that's sort of modern surgery. So then fast forward to the 90s, and in the 90s another invention comes along that enables a revolution in surgery, and that revolution is the small video camera. And what that enables you to do is, rather than do sort of surgery in the kind of traditional open way of open someone up, rummage around, do what you need to do, put everything back, sew them up, it enables you to do surgery instead by making very small incisions in the patient, 5 or 10 millimeters, and then through those incisions inserting long instruments, an instrument called an endoscope that you can look through, and then so the manual version of this sort of instrument, which has got a little grasper on the end, which you can then operate through the abdominal wall and do surgery. Now that's not a new idea. That was invented 1900 or thereabouts, but you can imagine that in the 1900s it was very difficult. You had to bend down and look through the endoscope yourself, and then you had to kind of sort of do something with your other hand, and there were no decent light sources, so you couldn't see anything anyway. The miniature video camera enabled you to put the miniature video camera on the end of the endoscope, and then suddenly you could operate with 2 hands while somebody else held the camera, and you could look at a monitor and see what was going on. Fantastic. And it really is a breakthrough. So minimal access surgery, because you don't make the large hole that then has to heal up, people tend to recover from really very major surgery within a few days, and rather than weeks, and the complication rates are about half of open surgery. There's much less pain, which is also a big factor in these days of opiate addiction. So minimal access surgery, fantastic. But there is a big problem. And the big problem is that it is extraordinarily difficult to do. And so because it is so difficult, globally, only about half the procedures that could be done with minimal access techniques are done with minimal access techniques, which means millions of people a year, I mean literally millions of people a year, have the wrong kind of surgery. They have open surgery rather than minimal access, and it costs the NHS and healthcare providers around the world a lot of money, and it causes a great many patients a great deal of pain and extra complications. It's just a bad thing. And the reason for that, as I say, is because it's extraordinarily technically difficult. And it's worth just understanding why it's so technically difficult. First of all, you're looking through an endoscope, or you're looking at correction. You're looking at a monitor which is displaying the picture from an endoscope. And that's just a 2D picture. So you've lost your sense of depth perception. You can't, you haven't got the stereo depth perception anymore. Secondly, your instrument is just a stick with a little grasper on the end. It's kind of hard to do anything with it. Thirdly, you're operating through a pivot point because you've inserted the instrument through the abdomen. And that means that if you want the tip to go up, you have to move your hand down. Everything's backwards, which is obviously fairly tricky. And then you're probably operating over here and looking at a monitor over there. So you're doing about 3 frame of reference transformations in your head. It's really not surprising there aren't enough surgeons. This is a very long answer. I apologize. And so that then says, okay, you've got this massive need. There must be a better tool for surgeons to do this. And I like making tools. And this stems fundamentally from the fact that I'm lazy. And I like to find the easiest way to do things. And so Versius really was an answer to that question of how can we give surgeons a better tool? How can we use technology to provide that better tool? What are what the characteristics has that tool got to have? And do we think we can sort of make one that we can then ensure that everyone can have? Because we've no desire to just invent a robot. There's no point in just inventing a robot. CMR, I've often said, is incidentally a robotics company. Our mission is to ensure everyone has minimal access surgery. That's something worth doing. A robot is our way of achieving it.
Thank you so much.
So you've brought a model, you've made yourself with us. Would you be able to describe the different components of it?
Yes. So people often say, or have often said, oh, you had this model before you started the company. We didn't. That's not true. This is a model of a robot arm, and it's a model of a robot arm with one rather special characteristic that I'll explain in a second. But it's a model of the robot arms that are part of the Versius system. So let me just briefly describe Versius to give it some context. The Versius system consists of a console, which has got a 3D monitor, and some hand controllers, which look very, very similar to, say, a Nintendo Wii controller, connected to it via linkages, and the surgeon sits at the console, looks at the monitor, gets a 3D view because it's a 3D monitor. They hold the controls, they move their hands up, down, left, right, and the robots move the instruments inside the patient up, down, left, right as well. So essentially it's a telepresence system. And the most sophisticated part of Versius is the robot arms that hold the instruments. And this is a model of one of these robot arms. And we had to create the robot arms for Versius from scratch. And we didn't just do it for fun. It was fun, but we didn't just do it for fun. And we did it because the requirements for a robot arm to do laparoscopic surgery are very different from the requirements for a robot arm that is used to, say, assemble cars. I mean, those kind of robot arms are fantastic pieces of technology. They'll throw around, a few kilos to microns accuracy 24/7 for 10 years. They're incredible. But there's a lot of reasons why you can't use them for surgery. The first and most obvious reason is you really don't want to stand next one. If it's over there and it's going to go over there and you happen to be in the way, that's bad news for you. But there's a more fundamental reason, and it's to do with the way those robots work. And that's actually why I made the original of this model, which was to help explain to our investors and other people why the Versius robot arms were going to be different. This is a copy of the original I made about 10 years ago. We actually, people started wanting their copies of the original. You can tell this is a copy because it's much better made than the original one. One of the fun things about this is, as I say, there's a number of these dotted about the place. One of them is in the Science Museum in London, which is kind of cool. But let's just talk about it for a second. So this is a model of a robot arm. And it is divided into joints, like almost all robot arms. J1, first joint, is down here at the bottom. It does that. You've got J2 here, and you've got another joint here and another joint here. And the purpose of these joints is to put the wrist here, the payload, in the right place in space. They operate like a crane. So far, so normal robotic. Now, this robot is a little bit special in that it shares a characteristic with your arm, which industrial robots don't usually have, which is that it's got a joint here as well. Why does it have a joint there? It has a joint there so that, like your arm, if I'm holding something in space, X, Y, Z, and pointing it in a particular direction, roll, pitch, yaw, I can still move my elbow and keep this thing in the same place, pointing in the same direction. You need this joint to enable that. Robots like that exist. That's not why Versius is special. Versius is special because of its wrist joint. A conventional robotic wrist has 3 joints in it. A roll joint back here, a pitch joint here, and a roll joint at the end, not modelled. And that is enough to point the payload in any direction. Roll, pitch, yaw. It's fantastic. And that's what all industrial robots have. But there is a problem when you try to use a robot like that for laparoscopic surgery, because robots like that have been around since the 60s, and people have been trying to use them for laparoscopic surgery for nearly as long, and not succeeding. And that problem is that you need a decent range of motion, to do laparoscopic surgery. It may not seem obvious, but actually you do need to move around quite a lot. And if I gave an instrument like this, let's imagine this is a manual instrument for a second, to an industrial robot, that's going to block the camera, not clever. If I gave an instrument like this to an industrial robot, it would have to hold it like this. And you can see immediately that if I hold an instrument like this, I just can't reach very far. In fact, if you look at pictures of laparoscopic surgeons, they hold instruments like this. And you can see immediately, for the same arm, I can reach much further. But this is really hard for a robot with a joint that I described, because you've got a roll joint here, you've got a roll joint at the end, and you've got a pitch joint in the middle. So you're straight on. You can go side to side. Fantastic. You can't go up and down. None of your joints bend in that direction. These 2 joints have become redundant. So if you're an industrial robot, what you do is you stop, you roll everything round a bit, and now suddenly you've got this pitch joint that goes up and down, and you can go up and down. Brilliant. Can't go side to side. That's not a problem for an industrial robot. They tend to follow a pre-programmed track. They can sort themselves out. We're always moving in response to the inputs from the surgeon, so we have to be cleverer. And so actually what we did in Versius, what was illustrated in this model, before I pushed it over, was that as well as having one pitch joint here, we have a yaw joint as well. And so effectively we have a driven universal joint. So we have, pretty much uniquely, a robot arm with 8 joints in it. 6 joints for a standard industrial robot, 7 joints for one like your arm, 8 to enable you to operate with an instrument straight on. And that suddenly means you can set up robot arms that are not too big around a patient and have them hold laparoscopic instruments and be guided by a surgeon to do surgery.
So do you think this kind of technology could eventually replace doctors in the world of surgery, or do you think it's something that works alongside doctors in surgery?
Very good question. So at the moment, the surgical robot is a tool for surgeons to use. Versius is, in many ways, pretty dumb. You're sitting at a console, you move your hands up, down, left, right. The robots move the instruments up, down, left, right. And the job of doing surgery is made hugely easier, but if you stop moving the controls, the robots stop moving. So really, as I say, it's a robotic telepresence system. robot is such a broad term, it's almost useless. But there's a few ways in which I think it is helpful to think about where the technology is going. And I think cars is quite a useful model here. If you think about cars from 50 years ago, you were basically connected to the brakes by hydraulics and to the steering wheel by some gears, and the car just did what you told it to do. That's kind of analogous to Versius now. If you think about cars now, you've got a tremendous amount of intelligence between your foot and what the brakes actually do. You've got a tremendous amount of intelligence between the steering wheel and what the wheels actually do. I mean, my car, in fact, can sort of more or less drive itself along the highway. So what's happened is not a shift from a car now just completely replacing a driver, but a gradual shift in the kind of sort of machine-human control barriers. And so will Versius ever become autonomous? Conceivably. But what I think is actually much more likely to happen is you're kind of going to get the robot surgery equivalent of anti-lock brakes. And you'll also get the robot surgery equivalent of Google Maps. So, you know, you're doing this procedure. First thing you do is this. Second thing you do is that. Third thing you do is that. And it's marked on the anatomy inside. And gradually, you know, things start to join up, much as they have in cars. But I think it'll be a very long process.
So how do you think the evolution of the robot will be in 5 to 10 years' time?
I think the evolution of the robot will be in that gradual evolution. It's important to understand how it takes place, though. One of the things, there's two things about surgical robots which are not obvious but are really quite important when you think about them. And neither of them, I should get this out of the way again, neither of them are about just doing the surgery. The first is that with a surgical robot, for the first time ever, you are putting something between the surgeon and their patient which is capable of mediating that interaction. As I say, at the moment, Versius doesn't really much, but in principle, it could. And the second thing is that for the first time ever, you are gathering data about how surgery is actually performed. Surgery at the moment is essentially an artisanal process. Students learn from the master and then go on to pass it on to further students. If someone thinks of a better way of doing surgery, a better procedure, they run a clinical trial with a few hundred patients. They hope to see some improvement in the very crude metrics we have for measuring clinical outcomes. If it succeeds, they write a paper, they tell their friends, they go to their conferences, and maybe it gets picked up and passed on. I'm summarizing a bit, but that's basically it. Now contrast that with an approach where you have thousands of systems like Versius doing hundreds of procedures a year, recording precisely how the instrument tips are moving, because of course they're on the end of a robot arm, we know exactly where they are. Also recording exactly how the surgeons are using the controls, what buttons they're pressing, and they know what procedures are being done, and they know what the clinical outcomes of those procedures are. Suddenly you can start to see that surgeons which tie their knot this way get ever so slightly better results from surgeons who tie their knot that way. Surgeons who clearly do stage A, then stage B, then stage C, get better results than one who do A, B, C. You forgot to finish B, C, and so on. And you can present that data back to surgeons and to hospitals in a quantified way. So one of the questions I get asked is, does Versius make surgeons better surgeons? Slight trick question. The trick answer is yes and no. No, because they're exactly the same person who got up from the console who sat down at it. You know, they haven't changed. But yes, because from the perspective of their patients, maybe they're able to take on procedures they couldn't do before because they're not as technically challenging. But the real answer to yes is because Versius can provide them information and data they can learn from. Pretty much every surgeon I have ever met is keen to be a better surgeon. The thing that lets them be a better surgeon is information, and the more quantified that information is, the better. So if you can develop a knot tying metric, for example, tying knots is one of the hardest things surgeons can do, and say, look, here's the global population of surgeons, a distribution, and you're over here. Maybe it's worth you going away and doing a little bit of practice. That is valuable. And it's important to make that a data-driven decision, in part because of the psychology of surgeons. I've spoken to hundreds of surgeons over the years. They will all agree that 50% of surgeons are below average. Everyone I've spoken to is in the upper quartile. It's just the way it is. That's not a bug, it's a feature. You know, if you're going to go up to someone and say, oh yeah, we're going to open you up, rummage around, sew everything together, put you back, you need a certain confidence. That confidence can also make conversations about performance, about ways to improve, sort of personal and difficult. If you can make them data-driven, they become much easier. And then the other thing is you've got this ability to mediate. So Versius, I say, is essentially dumb. If you go off and poke something you shouldn't poke, it has no context, it has no understanding of surgery. With the data that we're building up, we can start to give the system that context and understanding of surgery. And so actually, when you go and poke something, or when you go towards poking something you shouldn't poke, actually maybe it goes, are you sure? Now most of the time it doesn't do that, just like most of the time the anti-lock brakes on your car don't kick in. But when they do, you're glad it does. And likewise, most surgery goes fine, otherwise we wouldn't do surgery. But there is that long tail of cases in which something goes wrong, and you don't have to stop very many of them in order to make a difference. So that, I think, is how I'd see them evolving.
So with telesurgery, there's a lot of advantages, arguably over doctor-led surgery, and also disadvantages. But one advantage that has been seen is a decrease in rate of infection. So do you think that is an important advantage that could kind of distinguish between doctor-led surgery and through the robot?
I don't quite know what you mean by doctor-led surgery, but it's certainly true that one of the big advantages of minimal access surgery is that since you don't create the large sort of hole in the patient, you don't create that passageway by which bacteria and things can get into the body. And it's undoubtedly true the complication rates for the same procedure done with minimal access techniques versus open techniques is about half. And yes, that is one of the big drivers for minimal access surgery. And therefore it is one of the big drivers for robotic surgery. There isn't actually a lot of difference between manual laparoscopic surgery and robotic laparoscopic surgery. They're essentially the same procedure. The robot just makes it an awful lot easier to perform.
Yeah. So if it hasn't already, how do you think AI is going to interlink as it progresses, or how has it already interlinked?
Yeah. There's a number of ways which the collection of technologies sort of bracketed as AI are helpful, will undoubtedly be helpful. The first is that when it's in operation, Versius generates a colossal amount of data. You know, all the joint positions, all the torque sensor positions, everything about the instruments, how the surgeon's looking at it, the video data. And of course, we gather the clinical data, the patient outcomes, and all the rest of it. It is literally terabytes of data generated every week. Data is one thing. In order to be valuable, actually you want to be able to extract information about techniques, about things the surgeon does, about the segments of the surgery. Machine learning techniques are extremely valuable for trawling through very, very big data sets, trying to spot patterns, trying to move from just having data to actually having knowledge and ultimately, hopefully, actionable insight. So in terms of being able to analyze those data sets, machine learning techniques are very useful. The other thing that machine learning is very useful for is in enabling Versius to have a real-time understanding, some context about the surgery. So if I want to be able to say, don't poke that, I need to have a knowledge gleaned from the video feed, gleaned from the positions of the robot, you know, as to where the instruments are and what they might accidentally poke. And again, machine learning techniques are extremely valuable for doing things like anatomy, identification, and sort of flashing up those kinds of warnings. So at the moment, their value is in processing very large amounts of relatively unstructured data and being able to glean useful knowledge about that data set.
Do you think that will change much in the future? And if so, how?
I think it will change because you will be able to do more of it in real time as processors get faster. So rather than having to upload all the data as we do at the moment, load it into Amazon, process it, and then spit out some answers and be able to say to a surgeon, look, you know, on that surgery, your suturing score was 9.7 out of 10, well done, or 3 out of 10, go and do some lessons. I think actually you'll be able then to be able to start to provide that in feedback in real time, because you've got the processing power in the console rather than having to do it offline.
That would be very useful too.
So do you believe that the advantages of telesurgery at the moment outweigh the disadvantages? One of the disadvantages being maybe the ethical issues behind, of course this is kind of an online database to tell the robot what to do, so there could be possibly like data leaks or cyber attacks, which is a low chance, but still an ethical issue that would be present with patient information.
Yeah, so I think I would, what you're touching on there is actually a really important issue for all medical device development. It doesn't just apply to surgical robots, it applies to just about everything. And what it is that's a specific subset of something I would call risk management, and ultimately risk benefit. So whenever you develop a medical device, there's a set of activities that you have to go through in order to evaluate the risks that the use of that medical device entails, and that could be a data leak. Frankly, laparoscopic surgery involves moving sharp, pointy things around inside someone. You know, there are clearly other risks. Yeah. And those things are now being held by a robot. What if that robot goes whee, and you know, bad things would happen. And so you have to do a great deal of a risk analysis. What happens if this breaks? What happens if that breaks? What happens if the software crashes? Wherever possible, mitigate those things by design. But, and this is something it can take people a bit of time to get their heads around, robotic surgery is dangerous. Mm-hmm. Surgery is dangerous. No one goes off and has laparoscopic surgery just for fun. You have laparoscopic surgery, much as 6,000 years ago, because the alternatives are worse. Yeah. And so all these decisions are made on the basis of risk benefit. You know, there is a certain risk to the patient. Actually, is that risk worth taking? Now that can lead to some actually really quite scary things. You know, there are medical devices out there that have a 50% chance of killing the patient. But actually, if the medical device is not used, the patient's going to die. Yeah. So therefore, you use the medical device. Now it's interesting to contrast that safety model with the safety model that, say, applies to industrial robots or to cars or to aeroplanes. The amount of risk analysis and safety work that goes into those things is actually hugely greater than the amount of work that goes into medical devices, because when you get into a car, you're alive, and it's reasonable to expect to be alive when you get out the other end, likewise an aeroplane. You don't have a risk-benefit argument you can make. So when it comes down to things like data sharing and creating databases, what you have to do the same thing. You know, what are the potential benefits for this, as opposed to what are the risks? And there's a whole pile of standards and safeguards and things that you put in place around, you know, and actually, if your answer was, I don't care, we're just going to stream all the data unencrypted, no protections, anyone hacker can find it, then probably the risk-benefit analysis says, no, that's not worth doing. And so then the risk analysis says, well, suppose I put some safeguards around it. Suppose I pseudo-anonymize the data. Suppose I encrypt it. Suppose I ensure that I'm compliant with the various EU data directives. Now, having done all that extra work, put in place those risk control measures, the risk-benefit analysis is positive, and therefore we do it.
What's been your greatest challenge that you faced within designing the robots and being a part of the process, and how have you overcome that challenge?
So, about 10 years ago, I coined a phrase, and that phrase was, everything about surgical robots is hard. And I was referring just to the technology, because the technology is pretty difficult, because the challenging thing about surgical robot as a system is that it's got to work all the way from surgeon controls through to instrument tip movement, and that's an awful lot of stuff, and if any of it's wrong, the whole thing doesn't work. And the really challenging thing is keeping your head around all of it, because it's very easy to engineer it so that 95% of it works, but then to fix the last 5%, you need to change the other 95%. And that's a loop that can go on forever. After having been in the market for surgical robots and been using these things clinically for 5 years, I can now say that everything about surgical robots is hard. However, you talked about the greatest challenge. Actually, I don't think the greatest challenge is really around for doing something like CMR, is actually really around the technology or even the market or anything else like that. The greatest challenge is always around people. When the decision actually to do with Versius that I'm proudest of is, once I'd decided this was something I wanted to do, I recognized that it was not something I could do myself, and I found myself 4 co-founders who complemented me and complemented each other in everything they could do, and together we were able to create CMR. And when I look at the things over the years that have gone really well, and also the things that have gone really badly, and you don't run a startup company for 10 years without some things going really badly, they've always actually had their root cause in people, either having the right person in the right place at the right time, or the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it's a jolly hard one. And I think the best advice I think I would give to that in terms of working out how to mitigate it is, first of all, be aware of it. You'd be staggered at the number of people who aren't aware of it. And secondly, time. Getting to know someone, understanding what they can do, what they do well, what they do less well, is fundamentally a thing to do with time. And so my mitigation would be, don't rush it.
Thank you. Right, do we have any questions from the audience at the moment? Yeah, I'll bring the mic.
You mentioned that your background wasn't in the medical field.
Correct.
Were there any hurdles you had to jump to get from your original where you were in your career to now making robots for a very niche?
Not really. So there's a bunch of information and sort of knowledge and capabilities and things I've learnt over the years that have certainly been very, very useful. But if this is an area you're interested in, there really aren't particularly engineering degree courses in medical device engineering, and frankly, I'm not sure I'd recommend them even if they existed. The 2 things that I think have always stood me in good stead are a very, very good grasp of the basics. And again, this comes slightly from being a physicist. I'm not an engineer. I don't approach things with, there's an old joke, if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. One of the slight dangers of engineering courses and engineering, and you can guard against it, is you learn your techniques and your processes and then you try to use them to solve problems. As a physicist, I think I've always had an advantage that I sort of take a step back and start with, is this at all physically possible? And if it is, what's the best way of doing it? But the second thing is the ability to keep on learning. The most important thing you can learn is how to rapidly learn. And spending a good few years in contract R&D consultancy was very valuable for that, because you never quite know what's going to hit your desk from moment to moment, and you need to be able to learn. And even today, I am staggered by the number of people, engineers my engineers, I have a department of about 170, who younger than me, who say, I'm an electronics engineer. I don't want to do that, that's not electronics. And I'm never very impressed. The ability to learn, to understand the basic patterns, to apply that kind of irrespective of the medium is the thing that I would suggest is the strongest and most useful thing to learn, no matter what you want to do, even if you're aerospace, medical, it really doesn't matter. And learn Python, that would be the other one. Everybody should learn how to learn Python, should know how to do Python, irrespective of their career. I'd recommend it for all clinicians, for example.
Any other questions?
Have these robots actually been approved, and like, are they widely used by organisations like the NHS and like private health?
Yes, absolutely. The question of approval is a good one. So one of the things that is special about medical devices is that they do need to be, there are regulations around their use and their approval. Like all products sold in the EU, for example, they need to have a CE mark. But unlike most products sold in the EU, you can't just you can't self-certify. You have to go to an external authority who will inspect everything about the system and how you've engineered it, and if they think you've done a good job, they will grant you a CE mark. So Versius is approved for clinical use in Europe, the UK, and America. So we have a FDA approval as well, and most other countries in the world will base their approval processes around those approval processes. So to date we have about 160 systems installed around the world and have done over 26,000 surgical procedures.
If this was to malfunction in surgery, how would you go about resolving that issue? Is the blame on the robot or the doctor? How would you?
Well, if it malfunctions, so it breaks down, clearly it's the robot's fault. The question then is what do you do about it? And then again, this comes down to the kind of risk analysis techniques and the risk-benefit arguments. And so Versius is continually self-checking. So just about everything about it is cross-checking against itself. So every joint, for example, has 2 encoders on it to tell you the position of the joint, and if they agree, everything's fine, and if they disagree, then the thing thinks, help, something's broken, I don't understand what's going on. And for us, our safe condition is to freeze. The basic thing is, okay, right, I don't know what's going on, something's broken, I shall just stop. There are then ways to remove the instruments, put the robot to one side, and the surgery can continue without the robot. Now, the reason we're confident doing that is we've done all the risk analysis, and the risk analysis says that, okay, it's not great if the robot stops, but the patient is in a modern theatre, they're surrounded by surgeons and clinical staff who can look after them. Actually, the probability of it stopping and the harm associated with it stopping is more than outweighed by the benefits of having the surgery in the first place, so actually that's an acceptable result. You can imagine maybe for some medical procedure, actually once you've started it, you really, really shouldn't stop, at which case you would design the system so that not only perhaps were the encoders redundant, but the motors were as well, so if a motor burnt out, you've got a spare motor. It all comes down fundamentally to understanding that risk-benefit trade-off. The other point you said, though, was interesting, which is how do you cope with what happens if something goes wrong? Because things do go wrong. Surgery is not a 100% perfect environment. And this is where the data and the information is very valuable. Because all healthcare systems have ways of dealing with what goes wrong. And we certainly have processes in place such that should something go wrong, should someone be harmed, there are ways of taking all the data from the procedure and presenting it to an independent panel of experts, and they can then try to understand what's happened. Is it something that has the robot broken in some way, or perhaps the person using it has misused it in some way, or perhaps it's something completely unrelated to either of those things. So understanding those cases where things haven't gone wrong is actually a duty imposed on you as a medical device manufacturer, and also an entirely normal thing, because I'm afraid to say it's inevitable.
More of a brief question, but how much does it actually cost to produce, and then how much do you charge hospitals or organizations to buy one of these?
So a surgical robot is an inherently fairly expensive thing. Part of the reason why you want to keep them busy. You won't get much change from about $1.5 million if you just bought it. Though actually it's worth saying that we try to ensure that we have a range of options that people can use, because they can purchase them according to the individual needs of the hospital. I mean, let me give you an example of that. This is, I should pass this round actually. Let's pass that round. That is a surgical instrument for the Versius robot. It clips onto the robot. The robot drives the little lugs in the end backwards and forwards, and that makes the end of it articulate. So you've got wrists, makes surgery much easier. That instrument's got a set number of uses. It can be used 10 times, and then the mechanical wear and tear will be such that you need to throw it away. There's a number of different business models you can apply to supplying those instruments. One is you could just sell them to people. Here's our instrument, it's got 10 lives. Another is when they buy a Versius, they could get a contract a bit like a mobile phone, and that Versius could say, okay, and we'll supply you with all the instruments to do procedures to do 300 procedures a year. I much prefer that second model. And the reason I much prefer that second model is it shares the risk in what seems to be a more equitable way. If I can make a 15-life instrument or a 20-life instrument, then suddenly I'm incentivized to do so, because clearly I have to spend half as much money providing instruments. But also, if I sell someone a 10-life instrument, I reckon I'm selling them a guaranteed bad experience. Because if it's a grasper, it gets to 10 lives, it's still working fine. They're thinking, why have I got to throw away this instrument? It's fine. I've got to go buy another instrument, and they're quite expensive. Or if it gets to 5 lives and then breaks or goes blunt like a pair of scissors, they think, hang on, I bought this instrument, it's got 10 lives, I've got to throw it away after 5. There's no happy outcome. Unless the instrument actually breaks right at the end of the 10th use, you're guaranteed to make the customer feel like they're being ripped off. So I much prefer the model. Now, to answer your original question, for just about any business to stay in business, you need to be making a margin of 50 or 60% or so. The bill of materials costs and the service costs and everything else for the system are not insignificant, but that more or less answers your question.
Thank you very, very much. I'm sure we've all learned a little bit of something new today, and I definitely have. So thank you very much, Luke.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so
It's been
much.
a great
for
pleasure to
coming.
talk to you.